Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Robin Archer, and I'm the Director of the Ralph Miliband Programme here at the London School of Economics. And I couldn't be more delighted than to introduce our speaker today, Amit Chaudhuri. Amit's a novelist, a poet, an essayist, a critic, and a musician. He was born in Calcutta and educated in Bombay, London, and Oxford, and he's currently the Professor of Contemporary Literature at the University of East Anglia, and he's a member of the Royal Society of Literature. Amit's the author of 7 novels. The first of them was A Strange and Sublime Address, and most recently he's been the author of Odysseus Abroad and Friends of My Youth, published just a couple of years ago. They are, I think, very distinctive works. They're attentive and gentle and atmospheric, and they've received wide and deep recognition. In fact, I believe you've had 7 major awards for your novels alone. But Amit's work, that's only just part of his corpus. He's published numerous poems, essays, literary criticism, and he's also performed and recorded music, Indian classical music, the songs of Tagore, and what he calls experimental music. And in addition, he's engaged in forms of activism, one of which concerns architectural heritage, particularly in Calcutta, and a second with something that he calls literary activism, which, as I understand it, amongst other things, challenges the sort of over-specialisation of academic knowledge. Well, as you can see, Amit Chaudhuri is quite a remarkable person, and he's going to be speaking to us for about 45 minutes, something like that, and then we should have a good chunk of time for questions and discussion. But before he does that, can I ask you to join me in welcoming our speaker, Professor Amit Chaudhuri.
Thank you, Robin, for that introduction and for inviting me here, and wonderful to see you again after I think I last saw you in 1988. So do the arithmetic. So I've been thinking about modernity for quite some time, what it is, what it means, because it seems to have different meanings. It also seems to have different owners. Some cultures seem to own modernity, others seem to have a kind of relationship of having tried on modernity, of having tried to adopt it, either rejected it or embraced it to a certain extent. It also seems to have different. There's that kind
There's
of
a terrible echo, but I think, is someone on the case with that? Okay. Not quite sure what we should do about it. Perhaps we need a bit more modernity.
I mean, I certainly don't want to listen to myself. I'm sorry that you have to do it, but I think if once we get that sorted, because it is quite distracting.
It is distracting. It's deeply distracting, in fact.
Sure. So will you switch that off? Yeah. Does this work? Yeah. Is this better? There's a slight echo, but maybe it's not as. Once we get that sorted.
This is unbelievable.
It's amazing.
It's unbelievable.
So should that be switched off, that one? Do you want to try that? Switching that off. That speaker off. It's gone. It's gone. It's gone. So if you just switch that off, because maybe that's the one which is causing the trouble.
I think you should be fine now, sorry.
It should be fine? Okay.
Sorry.
So I was talking about who owns modernity, what is modernity. And I'll begin with just a small anecdote, because I have a particular understanding of modernity, because I was so moved by it and formed by it. And retrospectively, I realized what I'd been formed by and moved by was modernity. And here I'm thinking of the city of Calcutta, which is where I came to believe retrospectively, I first encountered modernity. I became aware of Calcutta as constituting my encounter of modernity through another encounter, an echo. And that happened in New York in 1979, before it was packaged, before it became the first city of the world. In 1979, New York was not in great shape in terms of its economy. It had a reputation for being a dirty and dangerous city. If you visited New York, you were advised to avoid the subway. This was 79. And the world was still not a unipolar world. The Soviet Union existed, as you know. And so it was a world with various power centers. So to go to America was to discover a place, something which is very difficult to do now. The last time I felt I was discovering something new by traveling was when I went to Karachi, when the old excitement of discovery came to me. So anyway, there I was my first stop was San Diego, visiting a cousin who was doing quite well. I couldn't understand why I was depressed in San Diego. I was walking around, everything was very pretty. It was my first experience of an American suburb, the place where he lived. There were no loiterers, there were no pedestrians. There were just very pretty houses. And I couldn't understand the reason for my unhappiness. Then I went to New York and I smelt gasoline and urine and saw people pushing past. And I felt revived. And I thought, well, this is what my escapes to Calcutta meant to me and have meant to me when I would go away from the tall building in which I was living in Bombay to Calcutta and encounter something that comprised the unfamiliar within the familiar and something that was in process. So modernity, I do not think as a state of complete development, but a state which allows process and incompleteness. So this is, I would say, where I encountered this first must have been in Calcutta during my visits to Calcutta, and where my view from my uncle's my uncle's three-storied house were other two-storied or three-storied houses. And this taught me how to read James Joyce, the Dublin in Ulysses and Dubliners, and it taught me how to view the Les Enfants du Paradis, Marcel Carné's film, where the man brings a woman to his house and they're aware of what's behind the window of the other tenement. And this idea of the unfamiliar in the midst of the familiar and glimpsing something which is close at hand but foreign is what I understand by modernity, and it's a language which was given to me by my encounters with Calcutta. So whenever I don't find this, I mean in cities where I don't have the possibility of encountering life in that way, I do get kind of restive, and it's as if I need something, and my fix is the modern. That's my fix, and like an addict, I know where it exists and when it exists and when it doesn't. When I see it, when I find it, when I encounter it, like an addict, I'm immediately revived. I come back to life. I want to briefly now. So I'm going to now look at quotes I have typed out on several sheets of paper and try to make sense of them. The first two have to do with culture. And this is, I just happened to read this, or maybe reread this, a few days ago. The philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah, a Reith lecture, the first of his Reith lectures, querying the idea of Western culture, Western civilization. Is there such a thing, he asks. And he goes back to two quotations which for him are important quotations or important ideas, formative ideas to do with culture. The first is Matthew Arnold's idea of culture as a high kind of civilizational practice or agglomeration of practices. So poetry, dance, classical music, etc. The aesthetic realm. His quote from Arnold's 1869 Culture and Anarchy is, culture is the pursuit of our total perfection by means of getting to know on all the matters which most concern us, the best which has been thought and said in the world. So already here, though, there is a kind of hinting at a larger inheritance of culture than is usually admitted when culture is identified with a nation. So he's speaking about his right to the best that has been thought and said in the world. And in 1869, this is important for Arnold and for him to rethink what culture is, because he's a man much moved by texts from other parts of the world, outside of England, including the Bhagavad Gita, which is a very important text for Arnold. What Arnold says in 1869 is an echo of what Bengali citizens in Calcutta, and this I owe Rosinka Chaudhuri for this and various other bits of information about the 19th century and Bengal. What wealthy Bengalis went to see the Chief Justice in Calcutta in 1816, and the Chief Justice is writing about this in a letter to somebody in England, that they wanted to set up the Hindu college, and which was the first college of its kind in the colonized world, in Asia, but wanted it to be set up along lines which went beyond what might be understood to be an Oriental education. So apparently they said, and this is something that Arnold will echo decades later, we will take that which we find good and like best. So they too are in a way precursors of Arnold's relationship to what that moment is opening up in terms of availability and how we conceive of culture. Following on from Arnold, and these are the associations that are coming to my head as I read the first of the quotes about culture that Appiah mentions. Following on from Arnold and his saying, the best which has been thought and said in the world, which is, I suppose, a big thing for an Englishman to claim, despite the kind of the creation that's ongoing of empire, it's still a big thing to claim, and a radical move, not just an acquisitive move, but a radical move. And we understand the radical nature of the move by looking at the Bengalis in 1816, but also Borges, I think, in 1951. Many, many decades later, talking about the Argentine writer and tradition in the essay called The Argentine Writer and Tradition, where he also is making a radical move in connection with what culture might be as an inheritance, and raising and provoking us to question our ordinary ideas of ownership, which are so latent in the way we conceive of culture. Who owns this? Whose culture is it? So here is Borges. Now remember, Borges is not speaking to the West. He's speaking here to his Argentine contemporaries. He's rebutting them. He's engaged in a debate with them. The debate has to do with the fact that contemporary Argentinian fiction in his time had at that point of time, very clear ideas about what constituted authentic Argentine features in Argentinian writing. And there was a kind of fashion to do with gaucho writing at that time, which he's refuting by saying firstly, that Argentine writing, in order to be Argentine, doesn't have to have any clear markers of being Argentine. And secondly, it might have a strange, radical relationship with world culture, which challenges ideas of ownership, what's Argentine and what's not. So this is Borges. What is our Argentine tradition? I believe we can answer this question easily and that there is no problem here. I believe our tradition is all of Western culture. And I also believe we have a right to this tradition greater than that which the inhabitants of one or another Western nation might have. That's the provocation he's making. We have a right to these traditions more than they do. But he's making it not to them, but to his contemporaries. So we can see that far beyond writing back to the empire, etc., there are all kinds of moves being made in order to create an idea of culture which subverts ready-made ideas of authenticity and ownership. And maybe Arnold is carrying out similar moves as he formulates culture. So he's not just laying down the law. He's having to kind of explain what his relationship to world culture is as an Englishman. So you have Arnold's definition of culture, and then the second definition that Appia mentions is the founder of cultural anthropology, Edward Burnett Tyler's definition. And that's the kind of anthropological idea of culture that we're familiar with. Culture is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, arts, morals, law, customs, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. So it's everything, basically. It's not just the classical music or the cathedrals. It's everything we do, the clothes we wear, but also all our profane everyday activities. Appia claims that there's possibly a fusion somewhere in these two ideas of culture in the West, where culture is seen to be synonymous with the West. Culture becomes Western culture. But the inheritors of Western culture also includes people who know nothing in the West about Western culture. So if culture is everything, as Tyler says it is, then the person who according to Appia, listens to Beyonce or whatever, has never heard of Stravinsky, can also lay a claim to that being their culture, because there's been a fusion at some point in this idea of culture related to ownership. As an Indian, I might maybe know more about, let's say, theoretically speaking, more about Stravinsky or Mozart than a Western person who might know more about some everyday aspect of their culture. But I don't have that ownership which the fusion of these two ideas of culture gives to the Western person who may know nothing about the Arnoldian sense of culture, the sense of culture as formulated by Matthew Arnold. So the question of ownership then is key. Whose culture is this? What is culture? Even as we formulate what culture is, we are also saying something about who owns it. And maybe the same can be said about modernity. That modernity is essentially Western modernity. Modernity is a synonym for the West. But if we actually look at various meanings of modernity and various ways in which it has existed in the last 200 years, it would seem to be a kind of conversation which complicates the idea of ownership. I've already quoted Borges, and Borges is just one instance of somebody trying to complicate and overturn the idea of ownership, or how we conceive of whose modernity it might be. But first, let me look at, since I've said in my title, The Problem of Modernity, let me look at some definitions of what modernity, some possible definitions of what modernity might be. And the first definition would be that modernity is progress, that modernity is where we are now, it's the present time, modernity is the future, modernity is a form of historicism, that is, it believes in us getting better and better and moving towards a future, where things will get better. The future is there to kind of realize unrealized goals and ambitions. The flip side of the coin is modernity is bad. We have lost something by becoming modern. The more modern we become, the more we lose something that's valuable. That's the flip side. That's the obverse of this idea of modernity. Modernity could also be a sense, an idea of empiricism, of rationality, and rationality through which one could critique all kinds of things, including the idea of modernity, including science, which is one of the features of modernity. One could use that sense of the rational and sense of the empirical to study the past, to enter into the disciplines of history and the social sciences, to study cultures from the point of view of the rational and the empirical. So the modern looks at the past as an archive, and from the point of view of a rational critical standpoint, a secular rational critical standpoint. That's another meaning of what it means to be modern. There's another meaning, and this meaning is the one I'm interested in, modernity as in connection to what I said earlier about Calcutta and New York, as a phase in which incompleteness and fragmentation is privileged over completeness. Modernity seems to be a time in which artists filmmakers, imaginative artists, writers, it seems to have been a time in which they have argued for the importance of the unfinished over the finished, the jagged and the rough over the polished, the fragmentary over the complete. The whole aesthetic position of modernism and related movements within modernity, which critique, in fact, modernity's kind of investment in progress, critique that investment without necessarily turning to a utopianism to do with the past. That is, modernism doesn't say, we don't like what's happening now. There was a golden period behind us. Let us try and recreate that golden period. Modernism eschews that kind of utopianism and puts in its place, in the place of a complete past or a whole, organically whole past, or even an unbroken rational consciousness, the idea of fragmentary consciousness, and let's say the idea of the ruin. To look at a ruin is of more interest to a modern than to look at a monument. Modernity is the time that creates, among other things, the figure of the flaneur, as theorized by Walter Benjamin, where Benjamin says, why was the flaneur born in Paris? Why does the flaneur belong to Paris? It's because Paris is not actually, according to him, so much a city of monuments as a city of slightly derelict urban settlements, roads, neighborhoods, and he says this is why the flaneur had to belong to Paris rather than to Rome, because Rome is the historic city, the city of monuments. And Benjamin says history is junk to the flaneur. The flaneur is not interested in the monument and in history and in looking at the monument. What he's far more interested, what absorbs him much more, I think the examples he gives is a weathered tile and a doorknob. So the weathered tile and the doorknob inverts the idea of what history is, just as earlier we were looking at the inversion of idea of ownership. For the flaneur, the Vatican or the Eiffel Tower or the Taj Mahal are not history, they are junk. But junk is history for the flaneur. That's the inversion that goes on over here within this space of the modern. This is something, this lineage is something that I'm very interested in, that modernity made a space of this kind which was aleatory, informed or shaped by indirection, and anti-utopian. There is even within modernism, of course, there is a conflation with the vocabulary of progress. So you will hear people talking about the latest avant-garde movements within the arts. That's how a lot of the 20th century was defined. People were talking about the new in the arts, arguing for the new in order to get rid of the static and the dead forms, but often the new was conflated with development. And it seemed that development in that sense was taking place in the West. The West owned the modern, and the West was the place where developments in the modern were taking place, even if we look at it in the domain of aesthetic experimentation, which on one level critiques development by going towards the undeveloped, semi-developed. Impressionism and post-impressionism are examples of breaking down the developments created by the Renaissance, breaking them down and undeveloping them. And yet, when we speak about Impressionism and post-impressionism, we often speak about them in the language of development. This was a new development. This was a new experiment. This was something new that happened. Connected to these kind of moves to do with positing the fragmentary against the complete and the importance of these moves, positing the importance of not knowing, the importance of loitering, the importance of uselessness over the useful, of loitering over going somewhere, of the fragmentary over the complete. Connected to this is a kind of fight against a hegemony. But the hegemony here that modernity is fighting against is an internal hegemony. The hegemony is not outside, it's often the self, often consciousness itself. The linearity of consciousness is often under attack. The consciousness is what we have, and we query it, we interrogate it as being somehow external, as somehow being a construct, taught to value certain things, and we begin to, if we are quarreling with that hegemony of our consciousness, as the idea of stream of consciousness does, we begin to value disruptions and discontinuities within the consciousness rather than what the consciousness is as a whole. Those disruptions and discontinuities become of much greater value in this quarrel. The quarrel with the internal hegemony that modernity and modernism comprise. So, as I reminded you, Borges, saying what he did, was aimed at other Argentine writers. It's a quarrel he's having not with the West, but within his own cultural milieu. Now, there's a problem with modernity in India in that it's a word which is seen with suspicion. It's a tainted word. And it's tainted because it's seen to be synonymous with derivation and the foreign. And often there is a view that modernity is something that we borrowed from the West. And there are historians who have spoken about how India had its instances of early modernity. And these instances of early modernity are pointed out on the basis of an idea of modernity as given to us by the West to do with individualism, the emergence of the individual, rationality in social contracts, etc. And these historians will point out, based on such ideas of modernity, that there are instances of early modernity in India. But then something happens. In India, we have almost the only instance of an early modernity where there is no late modernity. in other cultures, in other discussions of early modernity, the early modernity leads to something which then becomes fully formed modern. In India, modernity is something that was interrupted by colonialism. And then we had colonial modernity, which somehow derailed a pure modernity, a pure Indian modernity, which could have happened if colonialism hadn't happened. So you have these instances of early modernity, which are, I suppose, instances of pure Indian possibilities of the modern, which never become fully formed modernity. And so you have this astonishing nostalgia for a pure modernity in India, a modernity which never happened, but which was disturbed and then made impossible by colonialism, because after colonialism, it looks like the ways in which we became modern were basically derived from outside, brought in from outside, and therefore not to be engaged with, especially at this point in our history. We cannot engage with those forms of modernity. Our longing for a pure modernity, a pure Indian modernity, precludes our engagement with the nature of modernity that happened. When we look at the artists and writers in the modern period who are making various kinds of moves in the interests of what I've just told you earlier, which is this internal critique, this internal hegemony which is being attacked, the privileging of the incomplete and the fragmentary over the complete. When the Indian artists and writers are making those moves, they are making allies wherever they can in the past. So it could be, so when we say that this writer is, or artist, is rethinking through his work the Indian past or is engaging with the West, what is actually happening is they're engaging with that bit of the West or that bit of Indian art which furthers their agenda to do with the incomplete. So for a painter of the Bengal school, a painter like Binod Bihari Mukherjee, the incomplete frescoes of Ajanta become central. So he's not looking at everything in the Indian past as being useful to his agenda. What is revelatory to him, because of his investment in breaking things up, in fragmentation, are those Ajanta incomplete, difficult to see paintings within the caves. Similarly, when we look at an engagement with the West, we will find very particular decisions being made about which part of the West is being engaged with in the interests of that particular agenda. And this is happening in both directions. Arnold is engaging with the Gita because the Gita gives him an idea of detached action, an action which you undertake for the sake of the action without thinking of the fruit of action, as the Gita puts it. Arnold says this is what criticism is. Criticism is not objective assessment. It is a form of mental action which is both passionate and dispassionate. It has no immediately quantifiable fruit. There are various moments one could look at here, including Macaulay's Minutes. We don't have enough time, but Macaulay's Minutes, I would encourage you to have a look at his kind of presuppositions and erudite and eloquent arguments about culture and his Trump-like kind of cultural insanities in that minute. But it's wonderful to see how those were overturned by people like Arnold and Tagore. But also it's interesting to see in what ways the legacy of Macaulay has kind of survived with Nehruvian, partly with Nehruvian secularism. And one of the main ways, one of the main things articulated by the Macaulay's Minute is the idea that certain modes of knowledge, certain languages become outdated. He speaks about the Egyptian hieroglyphs. He says there's no point in educating people in the Indian languages because, these are outdated languages. And there are certain forms of knowledge which become useless. So he makes it very clear, and I think this part of Macaulay's legacy is important everywhere. He makes it very clear that there's a question of cultural ownership, but there's also a question of usefulness of culture and usefulness of knowledge. And education must be about knowledge that is useful. And Arnold, in invoking the Gita decades later, is talking about a detached knowledge which has no particular use when he's speaking about criticism as a particular kind of activity. And this whole idea of an action which is passionate but which has no clear outcome, then through the notion of impersonality also becomes central not only to what was important to Arnold, which is criticism, but to creativity. Eliot and Flaubert all strenuously argue for the creative event being a strange kind of event, which seems to be an expression of the self, but which is not. It is something else. It exists in a different space whose purpose and outcome aren't clear except the need not to express oneself. Tagore becomes a proponent of uselessness in many ways. He begins by, of course, as a child, hating school, not going to it, studying at home, so refuting the very pedagogy that was put in place by Macaulay. He recasts Kalidas as a modern. One of the things that Macaulay says is, I have never found one among them who could deny, this is the Orientalists, that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. So one of the things he's talking about when it comes to the West and its mark of modernity and civilization is concision. Indians are, and the Orient is verbose, it gets into overwriting. Western writing is by nature inscribed, concise, precise. And among the many refutations of Macaulay that Tagore consciously or unconsciously undertakes is his recasting of Kalidas as the fundamental poet, as is the case with Sanskrit poetics, of compression. And he says, well, Kalidas can do in 5 words what Shakespeare would take 50 words over, and he critiques Shakespeare for being verbose. So this is one of the moves that Tagore creates. I must mention Tagore's essay on children's nursery rhymes as an extremely important essay in the history of this other modernity that I'm talking about, where the random, the aleatory, the unfinished, the unimportant play such an important role in how we conceive of culture and the self. And he does this in his essay on nursery rhymes, 1894, the first instance of a writer mentioning the stream of consciousness as an idea. So the stream of consciousness as an idea is put out there by William James around 1891, I think. This is 1894. 1894, Tagore uses the phrase nitto probahito chetonar maje, in the midst of our daily flow of consciousness. Why is he saying this? He's saying that our minds are linear. The adult mind, he says, is linear. It goes on and on and on. It wants to reach a particular goal. But he's been collecting Bengali nursery rhymes not because of archival interest or because he's a historian who wants to create a store of oral culture, but because the Bengali nursery rhymes, he thinks, makes place for random consciousness, random movement. So he says the daily flow of consciousness will pick up all kinds of random, trivial matter, like a river does, branches, leaves, etc. The adult consciousness will filter that out. But the children's nursery rhyme in Bengali makes space of this unfiltered consciousness whose movements are random. And this is one of the first instances of a case being made for this other space of the modern, where the random or the onabashok, the word he uses, which is the superfluous, is given a place. Remember, this is done in argument with an inner hegemony. He's not arguing with the colonizer. He is arguing with what he calls the mind. He calls it this substance called the mind, which is so invested in moving on and on and on towards goal. Against this, he posits the onabashok, or the superfluous, in the daily stream of consciousness that is embodied in these nursery rhymes. I think what happened after independence, and especially in the last 25 years, and some of these thoughts are in my head also because of the, for me, distressing election results in India, and also my kind of my sense of distress too about the inheritors of secular modernity in India. And I think in the last 25 years, the secular modern in India became more or less an Anglophone person. And the English language was used, and everything connected to the English language and in education was used in the instrumental way, which long ago Macaulay had suggested was the right way of using knowledge. The connection with the Indian languages was wrongly cast as being necessary only for the requirements of authenticity, cultural authenticity, and a connection with the immemorial and the traditional. But the Indian languages were always the new languages. It wasn't the English language which was the new language in India. Bengali was a new language because of the way it conceived of modernity. Bengali was very unlike, let's say, and Bengali is just one example I'm giving. You could say this of many other languages, which emerged in the 19th century, not as a form of Gaelic, that is not as a form of the expression of identity or nationalism, but as an expression of that ambivalence which we call modernity. So whatever Yeats and Joyce had to do as artists to express this, they did in English. They rejected Gaelic because it would have constrained them. Bengalis turned from English to Bengali and created not a language of identity, but a language of this ambivalence to do with the modern. And this took us out of a utilitarian idea of knowledge and language into a far more unpredictable space in which also uselessness played a role. The role of uselessness for the Anglophone middle class in the last 25 years is something that has not been addressed. It has no role. Only the useful forms our idea of what knowledge is and what modernity is and what the secular is. But the secular is not only useful, it is also a space for responses to do with the useless, to do with the inconsequential, to do with the insignificant. This will play a very, very small role in the Anglophone imagination of the last 25 years or 30 years. I regret the loss of a particular kind of secular modernity in India in the last 30 years. And I regret a almost professionalized understanding of the secular. By professionalized, I mean over here somebody who has to reiterate the same thing, the importance of the same thing again and again and again, and never be distracted from it into an area of value whose language and whose presence is not ready-made. A sudden disruption, sudden openness into an area which could be misunderstood as being useless or mysterious or unfathomable, those areas have been more or less marginalized from an understanding of knowledge and of the secular as something we almost professionally understand for being one particular thing and which we then repeat again and again, instead of allowing ourselves the actual unpredictability of the history of secular modernism or secular modernity. And this has, I think, created a kind of intellectual bankruptcy, a sense of hollowness in the secularism that is a professional position, far removed from the more random world which secularism or the secular and the modern encompassed in various Indian languages. Okay, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Let's see, we've got a good chunk of time for questions and discussion. So does anyone want to signal first of all? Okay, just wait until the microphone comes, and if you just say who you are and you know where you're from institutionally, if you're from somewhere, for our podcast audience. Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much for that very interesting and stimulating talk. It was very enjoyable to follow your thought process and the issues you were going across. My name is Donald Ide. I'm a development worker, ex-LSE student. What I found really interesting, the point at which I joined in, was this statement that you made about, if you like, this hierarchy of consciousness, particularly when you were talking about Macaulay. And I think you did not, to a significant extent, elaborate enough about the power relationships, because he was not just distinguishing, he was also evaluating and creating hierarchies between different forms of knowledge. And that is what I think is also, if you like, the problem of modernity for the post-colonial as we go on, because we are not always able to completely take our place within that conversation that's taking place. So at one time, if you look at Eliot, for example, the consciousness which is fragmented, it's kind of universal. He takes from the marginals, he takes from all different cultures. But that conversation leaves out the other. It leaves out, I think it's an unfinished conversation. And I think that's the sort of the power relations is the difficulty we have in getting back into that conversation, because you always end up speaking from the margin. Thank you. If I had a question about that, it was, what's the place of the sort of chronology about time in the conversation? Because you were skirting around the issue, but I think that is also important in terms of making sense of the fragments and how the margins speak back to the center of that conversation going on about what is culture and who creates it and what's it all about and what's at the edges of that conversation. Thank you.
So, what I'm trying to do here is maybe depart from the model of the margin and the center. And we can come back in a second to whether this model also has and continues to have validity. It certainly has centrality. It's had this model, margin center, has had centrality intellectually, academically, professionally in the last 30, 40 years. There's no doubt about that. And therefore, centrality, legitimacy confers a kind of validity. But I'm trying to move out of that. And we'll come back in a second as to whether it will always have some validity. But I think one of the ways I'm trying to move out of it is by looking at the whole idea of the internal critique and the idea that whoever you are, in whichever part of your culture, the internal hegemony for the creative, imaginative person will always be more powerful than the external one. And the moves that will be made because of the constraining nature of the internal hegemony. And when the moves are made, affinities will be formed which are unexpected and not necessarily always ethnically or racially legitimate. You might make all kinds of affinities as you critique the constrainment of this internal hegemony. But from the outside, you would say that, well, what do we mean by internal hegemonies? Because they are basically different sorts of cultures. And some cultures are modern, some cultures are secular, other cultures are religious, some cultures are predominantly now fundamentalist, etc., etc. But then the way we encounter things and the way we encounter even art objects often will need us to revise what we use as a model with which to understand the position of that art object within a culture. So I watch an Iranian film, and I think to myself, oh, that's great, I really like that film. I put into my subconscious the fact that I like it because I like non-narrative cinema. I put that to one side. But then I think, I like the film if I think a little bit more about it. But I don't like it because it tells me more about Iran. But that's the way I've been taught to understand my encounter with an art object in a different culture. That it tells me a bit about that culture. So no, it's a sense of recognition. But what kind of recognition is it? It's not the recognition of Iran and India being alike. No, it's the recognition of a person who likes non-narrative cinema encountering a culture that has produced persuasively a non-narrative expression of the imagination. But then I don't think any more about it. I put it to one side. The fact that this is not about Iran, this is not about Iran being like India. I put aside the fact that there must be multiple locations of argumentation against narrative that produces these things from further afield than I would have thought of. But you know, Satyajit Ray, the Indian filmmaker, had a similar feeling when he saw Kurosawa for the first time. He expected to see a Japanese film and to have it confirm certain ideas of what Japan was like. But then he found himself responding to it. He was really ready to respond to the Japanese qualities of the film. You know, to a putative Japanese film being shown. Then he realizes that what I'm responding to has nothing to do with it being Japanese. But it's not to do with it being a universal art object either. It has, again, to do with his particular approach to the image. There's another kind of Japanese film he may have had no time for if it did not fit into his position as a filmmaker, coming from his milieu, to do with his own argument and the argument of those before him in Bengal, to do with what is the image? What is a moment? Am I looking at creating a narrative, or am I looking at creating a succession of disconnected moments, which is what Ray went for. He found something similar in, what was the name of the film? The one with the three narratives of the same story. No, I'm talking about Kurosawa. Rashomon. So he saw Rashomon. And he responded to it on another level. Now this other level opens up the question to do with what are the argumentations in my culture and what are the argumentations in that culture that are making this encounter a meaningful encounter. And then it raises the other further questions to do with, then what is culture and what did I expect? What are my actual expectations of Japanese culture? Who am I as an Indian? If we have to put these ready-made concepts to one side, how then do we make sense of this particular map of argumentation? If we look at things only through center and margin, then we already have an idea of who's on the margin, who's on the center, and how these things work. And then the argumentation is always with somebody outside. It's not with me, it's them. For the left, it might be the right. For the right, it will be the left. And there are any number of such configurations. What I'm talking about here is a different kind of map. And from time to time, we become aware of the points in the map. The points in the map make us aware of the insufficiency of the language we have to deal usually with a map of the world which deals with concepts like east and west, north and south, margin and center more recently. I'm interested in finding a language for this other map, a very important one for me.
Okay, let's have another question. Yep, just wait for the microphone again and say who you are and so on.
I don't think it's working.
Yeah, mate, just wait a sec. This bloke will fix it up. It's not the right day for these machines. Yep, there we go.
It's working.
Good evening. It's been truly a wonderful evening listening to Amit Chaudhuri. I'm Anshu Berry. I come from India and from Kolkata. I say Kolkata, in Bengali they say Kolkata. We're referring to here as Calcutta. So while Amit Chaudhuri was finding unfamiliarity in a familiar culture, what I'm finding today evening is familiarity in an unfamiliar place. And I'm truly enjoying it. Thank you, sir.
That's very kind of you. Thank you.
Very, very impressed with your thoughts. To me, what I've imbibed today is disruptiveness. When we encounter something in a disruption manner and which leads to a self-development or a kind of recognition or cognition that I've been able to do something better than what I was doing earlier, probably that would mean modernity in a true sense to me.
Thank you.
We've adapted to WhatsApp in a big way in India.
Hmm.
Yes,
I definitely have.
We are very social by nature.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have to, WhatsApp to each other living in Calcutta, we have some members in the group who would type a Bengali message, but in an English script. It's well understood, well communicated, since we've grown up with English as our first language in India. So to me, that is modernity. To me, that is ownership.
Yep. I'm sort of also trying to draw the idea of modernity into somewhat different areas, but I can see what you're saying.
So for me, it's actually finding in a very independent environment where I'm allowed to do something and ending up on a good result in a disruptive environment. Okay. I would look at that as being modern, and that change is very important for humankind. To be able to move, change is constant in our lives. And when we look at modern thinking, we're always looking for a change. It doesn't matter, east or west, doesn't matter. It's what makes me happy, what makes me have a sense of development is what I look at being modern.
Thanks very much. I want to get in a few more questions. So did you want to respond to these comments further?
No, let's get some more questions. Maybe.
A few more questions.
Yeah.
Thank you. Who else have we got? Yes, this gentleman at the front, please.
Paul McGrail, Peace News. You touched briefly on film, and I'm wondering why it is that in the past, say, 5 years, we've seen films coming out of Turkey and Iran, which are quite interesting and actually probe the identity of the. Well, they were very I found them very insightful, both as films and as an insight into those what's happening within those cultures. And yet, for some reason, even though the Indian film industry is much larger, I spent 3 years in the early 70s in India, and perhaps I'm wrong, but I'm sure the Bollywood monopoly, as it were, all the dancing and whatnot, that's probably not as strong as it was. But I've always found it sad that the Indian film, they don't see, at least they don't come to London. They don't actually touch on the situation, shall we say, the friction within India itself between the modern and now with the rise of Hindu nationalism and all that. Can you explain to me why there isn't Indian directors making top quality, non-dancing, non-musical Indian films?
Okay, well, I don't know what you want.
Well, you began by talking about Turkish and Iranian cinema. I've only seen a bit of Turkish cinema. I've liked what I've seen. And I have seen a little bit more of Iranian cinema, but then about 3 or 4 directors, what has struck me about Iranian cinema was what struck me was a particular quality privileging the art of filmmaking as as not a narrative art necessarily, as Hollywood has predominantly had it. And I'm imagining that that there would be followers of Hollywood in Iran. I'm imagining that they would form a majority. I don't think that all the Iranian filmgoers are fans of Kiarostami or Makmal Baf or Jafar Panahi. So I'm imagining there's some kind of a positioning going on there. Something opened up, something was argued for. I do not buy completely the story that given all the constraints to do with religion, Iranian filmmakers had to make use of children and the child's point of view. Because the child's point of view is being used in a very often in a Proustian way to open things up. So the film represents to me something about the culture and about the world that I don't know, but which I find exciting. And that is not the culture of Iran, as I said earlier, but a new sort of story of modernist decisions in creativity in the last 40 or 50 years. I'm also interested in the audiences of these films, both in Iran and in America and in India, and what it is that they're looking for and what it is that opens up for them. Because it's very important that something open up for us when we view something, let's say from Iran or America or England, that goes beyond a confirmation of our expectations, of our cultural expectations, that something else opens up. And something did open up in this case, I think, and continues to with Turkish cinema. What is that conversation? With Bollywood, with Hindi cinema, there is no there is no kind of blanket way in which we can define or understand the idiom of song and dance. There was song and dance. And there was in the 50s and 60s, the most artistic of the directors who worked in Hindi cinema, which at that time was still not called Bollywood, called picturization, by which they meant the imagining of those moments in which the singing and sometimes the dancing takes place. And in the 50s and 60s, these are moments of great imaginative visualization, cinematic thinking on the part of the director. Not every director, but certainly some of them. They are very unlike Hollywood musicals, which are really a form of theater, a form of Broadway on screen. If you look at what's happening in a Hollywood musical, there people are in a set, and you can see it's like a theatrical set. In Hindi films in the 50s and 60s, they're out in the open, and there's a fair amount of stillness, actually. Not a whole lot of choreography or huge amounts of people dancing away. The picturization becomes an occasion for creating an image. So within quite a narrative-driven plot, it might be that the song and dance actually serve as imagistic and cinematic interruptions. This happens a lot in Hindi cinema of the 50s and 60s, that there are moments of interruption where nothing is happening. The person is singing. The music is hugely innovative. The lyrics are extremely interesting. There's maybe a breeze disturbing the woman's hair, there's a close-up, lighting is at play, an image is being created, an interruption in narrative is being created. And that's the role of song in that cinema at that time. In the 80s, it becomes different. It becomes far more, orchestrated, choreographed. So, right now I would say Bollywood, if we are to use that word, has a branch of extremely interesting independent cinema within it. Very, very irreverent, very, very alive, very, very interesting. It's up to us to recognize it, to look for it, to find it, to see it for what it is.
Okay, yes, please. Just wait again for whoever's got the working microphone.
Hi, my name is Akriti. I met you last November at King's as well when you came to launch your book, Origins of Dislike. So it's the second time I'm seeing you within a span of a year. I'm really happy about that. So thank you very much for your talk today. I just had a question about the fact that you had mentioned there's an astonishing nostalgia about the way in which people the modernity in India was interrupted by what was known as colonialism, and had that not interfered with the early modernity, we would have witnessed something known as late modernity, which would have resulted in an end product of the final modern situation, as it were. I just wanted to ask you, what, according to you, would be moments of the emergence of modernity in India, even if that constitutes part of the early modernity that you were talking about?
My understanding of, within the period of what's called colonial modernity, what actually happens is a complete unfettering of modernity from Macaulay's understanding of modernity and education as being basically instrumental tools for a particular kind of progress and for people in India to become sort of interpreters of the West to India and India to the West. Complete unfettering from those aims to create a separate domain to do with often with the unpredictability of the imagination and revaluing things, including what is useful and what isn't. So within the last 200 years, there's a radical kind of argumentation to do with what is useful and what isn't useful, as in other parts of other narratives of modernity. I mentioned only one, Tagore's essay on nursery rhymes, which is one of the earliest anywhere of this kind of whole reinterpretation of the useful, of the importance of the superfluous, or onaboshuk, as is the word which he uses. My understanding of instances of modernity and other instances of modernity and early modernity would have to do with a different set of parameters from what the historians of early modernity in India have been looking for, which would be to do with Western ideas of what modernity might be, manifesting themselves at a different point in history. One of the interesting expressions of modernity for me would have to do with the emergence of and the shape that Indian classical music takes. Indian classical music and the way it tests, even in India, what are supposed to be ordinary forms of communication, like in a bhajan or in a song, you sing something, the words are understood, they are responded to. All this is completely mauled in Hindustani classical music. The words are taken apart, they become unimportant, they become phonetic sounds only used in the service of rag and tal. And therefore communication is put to one side, communication in the conventional sense. Rag itself, you know what is, a rag is a tune, it's a melody. But it is also ability in the hands of these practitioners for in khayal, in Indian classical music, for this melody to be stretched and probed and questioned infinitely, and to be deferred, its closure to be deferred infinitely. These are, I would say, instances of the non-representational, of the modernist impulse informing our arts. Another example, I would say, are these paintings from maybe the early 19th century. I think they were commissioned by Mansingh. There was an exhibition in London called The Garden and Cosmos. There were two different sets of paintings with different patrons that were being exhibited, I think, maybe for the first time in London. And one had to do with the rains and the world, and the other had and the garden, and the other had to do with the cosmos and man's relationship to it. And apparently, the commission happened because Mansingh, the king who commissioned them, was himself a devotee of a mystic sect. So in those paintings, you see a tiny individual afloat in a mass of nothingness. It's one of the earliest, predating by some decades, let's say Turner's paintings of train and steam, etc., and everything else that's about to happen to break up painting into basically something between thing and nothing. Early 19th century, I would say this is a manifestation of this kind of argumentation with representation, which I think of as the modern, and which comes so much from outside of the West, and which the West is doing business with in its quest, in its own argument, with what it's inherited from the muscularity of the Renaissance, the muscular hyper-realism of the Renaissance, which it wants to throw out, which it wants to leave behind. So you have instances of this in India. Of course, you have the embrace in India of the opposite of neoclassicism in kitsch. Starting with, before kitsch, with Raja Ravi Verma deciding to paint the gods and goddesses of Indian mythology as neoclassical figures. And then the neoclassical legacy is embraced by calendar art and kitsch, and to a certain extent by the genre called mythologicals in Hindi and other cinema. And then, of course, now by the BJP as well, which embraces neoclassicism and the Renaissance in its understanding of Hinduism, where Hinduism is the epics and those texts are no longer interesting for the reasons that they were interesting to Tagore, for their register, the ambiguity of register, their metaphors, their poetry, but because they show that Indians practiced plastic surgery or knew how to fly aeroplanes. The metaphorical side of language is of no interest to a neoclassicism, Renaissance-loving Hinduism that we see today.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much for that. I'm afraid we've come towards the end of our time. Thank you so much for an erudite talk. I mean, we've been thinking, I think, about modernity, and you've made a case for the importance of a particular version of modernity, one that's based on the fragmentary, the unfinished, the rough over the polished, as you put it. And then having sort of looked at how that relates to Indian culture, you came towards the end to make an argument which is rarely heard and is important, I think, that we should place value on things that are not in themselves determined by the criterion of usefulness. And that's an argument which applies to many of the points you've made, but maybe beyond as well, certainly within the walls of the university. So thank you very much again. Can you join me in thanking our speaker, Amit Chaudhuri?
Thank you so much.